Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unusual Scenes. I'm going to stop this share. Uh, we're so excited to have you all here. Welcome to the first iteration of Unusual Scenes, a series of unorthodox conversations in art history. This series has been a labor of love for myself and my co-founder, Julian Sanchez Gonzalez. We were motivated to create a forum for the creation of interdisciplinary scholarship of art history as a way of paralleling our own approaches to looking at and living with art. I personally study contemporary Afro-Cuban art, which in many ways performs slippages from traditional art historical scholarship. And so I turned to interdisciplinary scholarship and fields like queer and Black studies in my research and have found a non-traditional approach to understanding art key to my practice and to that of many of my peers. With this series, we hope to explore how methods and practices from fields outside of art history can create new modes of knowledge. Unusual Scenes was made possible through generous support from the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, ISLAA, the Department of Art History and Archaeology, the Media Center for Art History, and our advisor, Alexander Albero.
Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Julian Sanchez. I'm a PhD student in the Art History Department at Columbia University. And tonight, Gwen and I will be engaging in a conversation on the link between art historical and spiritual practices with two scholars we deeply admire for their rigorous, courageous, and heartfelt work, Professors Laura Pérez and Solimar Otero. By virtue of its oftentimes non-material qualities, as well as its notoriously subjective nature, the spiritual experience has been traditionally dismissed by modern rationalist thinking as an unreliable source for producing knowledge, as well as for shaping the different worlds we inhabit. Today, however, we think and feel differently. As an inherently human expression of being, free-flowing spiritual systems have traditionally been bridges to our connection with all that exceeds the confines of our corporeality and consciousness in a non-dogmatic and open-ended way that encourages love and understanding with each other, the environment, and the universe at large. Following the steps of disciplines such as anthropology and ethnography, spiritual and religious studies have grown exponentially as a legitimate field of inquiry within the broad scope of humanist thinking. What is more, a vast array of artistic and curatorial practices have increasingly exposed us to the tremendous value of spirituality as a gateway for building more sustainable and equitable futures. The resurgence of an interest in Amerindian shamanism, Afro-diasporic belief systems, and pagan expressions of witchcraft, Wicca, and occultism are all a clear expression of this rising trend. We believe that there is much more that can be said and done about this fertile relationship, for there is a pressing need for further and more experimental methodological explorations in the art historical field. This is the reason why we are gathered today in conversation. We hope this space will provide inspiration and strength as we go through one of the most challenging times in recent human history, which has forced us in more than one way to redeploy to our inner worlds and reevaluate the nature of our living conditions. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I also wanted to make a mention to the really beautiful poster that we have created for this series. The image for the poster was made by a very, very talented painter from the MFA program at Columbia University. His name is Sergio Miguel Acuña, and we really, really thank him for being that creative driving force for the creation, for the making of this poster. And we will share his website with you all in a little bit. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Solimar, for being here. Gwen?
Thank you. Yes, thank you both for being here. And thank you to our advisor, Alex, who's also here. So if you want to both quickly say hi.
Saludos.
So we'll begin with just brief presentations by Solimar and then Laura, and then we will go into a discussion, which the Q&A is available for anyone who's watching to submit a question that you would like answered. We'll get to what we can. Fortunately, because of time constraints, we won't be able to get to everyone, but we will try our hardest. So to begin, I will introduce Dr. Solimar Otero. Solimar Otero is a professor of the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, acting director of Latino Studies, and editor of Journal of Folklore Research at the University of Indiana Bloomington. She holds a PhD in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania and is the author of Archives of Conjure, Stories of the Dead and Afrolatinx Cultures, published by Columbia University Press in 2020, as well as Afro-Cuban Diasporas in the Atlantic World, published by Boydell and Brewer in 2010. Thank you, Solimar, for being here. We're very excited for this talk.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. I wanted to thank Gwen and Julian and Dr. Pérez and Dr. Albero for allowing me to be part of this conversation and engaging in this remarkable encuentro meeting. And I also wanted to thank ISLAA and the Department of Art History and Archaeology for inviting me and allowing for this conversation to start. So I'm gonna begin by sharing my screen. And I'm hoping that everybody can see that. Can I get an okay from one of the co-hosts?
Yeah, that's
okay,
good, so.
Thank you. And I will begin now. Thank you very much. It is a humid October morning in Mantilla, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Havana. I am sitting with my godmother, Tomasa, next to her prenda, an Afro-Cuban entity that is housed in a cauldron. She is communicating with El Señor, as he is known in our house, with the chamalongos, discs of dried coconut. Our conversation turns to spirit guides and how they make themselves known in dreams. Tomasa shares that all of the dead have given me their names in dreams. The first time I saw him, El Señor, standing by the window, it frightened me so that I woke up and I got up like a bolillo. And later, the second time that he revealed himself to me, now more or less, you understand me, little by little. I became adapted to it, but it isn't easy. At first, if you're scared of them, you can only imagine. And of course, I am giving you the translation from the Spanish here. Tomasa, as a Yaya in Kisi, is an elder priestess of the Afro-Cuban Palo tradition, and she's well-versed to talking to the dead. Tomasa's spirit guide, El Señor, acts like a father figure, a protector that serves as a resource for her and the spiritual community she serves. The revelation of the dead's names in dreams is significant. Naming is an especially powerful tool. Naming is an especially powerful tool in conjuring reality and presence. Thus, the revelation by El Señor signals a transference of power, of kinship, and the solidification of a mutual bond. It is understood that embarking on a journey of proclaimed kinship with the dead is not easy. It will challenge accepted standards of perception and reality, and it will take time. My book, Archives of Conjure, takes to heart Tomasa's suggestion of dreaming and vivifying the dead. In the study, the dead, ancestors, and deities are actors in multiple forms of kin and world making. Alongside these entities, the spiritual ecologies of the Afro-Latinx communities explored demand ontological reframings of the connections between humans, non-humans, and the environment. In reaching for an ethically engaged world from the perspective of Afro-Latinx religions, a material semiotics emerges that situates kinship beyond human-centered experiences of place, time, and materiality. To be specific, this work is about how Afro-Latinx non-material or occasionally material beings like Egun, the dead, and Orisha, deities, become active agents in the world through rituals, archives, and the creation of art and material culture. Sites like the ocean, the rivers, altars, libraries, and living rooms in Havana provide the context for understanding where these multiple engagements are activated. Residual transcriptions are links to how co-presences interact, influence, and guide human actors like scholars, artists, and practitioners. Residual transcriptions as vernacular notations made in rituals and found in archives create the routes to the collaborative, spiritual, scholarly, activist work that are Archives of Conjure. This work is not about official discourses found in religious institutional control of social behavior or the construction of subjectivity. Though I address histories of patriarchy, racism, Colonialism and Homophobia in Afro-Latinx Folk Religious Cultures, I am most interested in revealing the creative strategies presented by non-material agents in providing effective interventions in these legacies of violence. I use the term Afro-Latinx to describe the racial, cultural, and gendered fluidity present in transnational expressions of vernacular religious practices like Espiritismo, Palo, and Santeria, in order to place into historical context the vernacular narrations of stories told by the dead. Afro-Latinx vernacular traditions of narration and ritual kinships reveal a range of connections with the dead whose residual forms reside in archives, ritual, art, and material culture that house and activate them. Examining these practices of spirit and materiality as an archive of conjure, I argue, transmits the complexity of inhabiting multiple forms of being in terms of race, sexuality, and place. The residual transcriptions and practices explored in the book also point to different ways of looking for evidence or describing experience that both constitutes and vexes historiographic and ethnographic modes of investigating Afro-Latinx religious expressions and communities. Archives of Conjure pay particular attention to how divinities and spirit guides interact with and shape the kinds of work that scholars, practitioners, authors, and artists produce. My work explores how Afro-Latinx dead narrate temporality, cartography, and race into being through embodied practices like dreaming, stitching, washing, scribbling, beading, singing, dancing, and yes, writing. In doing so, one can observe the nature of the active presence of entities as collaborators, muses, co-authors in the creation of scholarship and the enactment of theory in Afro-Latinx religiosity. I experienced my own literary and archival cohabitation with Cuban ethnologist Lidia Cabrera in her Archive of Conjure. A defiant border crosser in terms of sexuality, scholarship, visual art, and religious expression, Cabrera wrote incessantly about water entities. Her book, Yemaya y Ochun, significantly shapes understandings of the two divinities through sexuality and the homoerotic feminine. Over the last 8 years, I have interacted with Cabrera's notes, letters, drawings, and scribbling in her archive at Cuban Heritage Collection that is housed at the University of Miami Libraries. What I found shows a daughter of Yemaya whose ties to the ocean make her an ambivalent sojourner who never felt entirely at home in one place. Her kinship with like-minded authors and scholar artists like Reynaldo Arenas and Pierre Verger comes through the sea as a site of contemplation and acceptance within the experience of being a Caribbean sexile. Mobility, but also statelessness, is fueled for Cabrera by societal structures that govern notions of gendered and sexual respectability in both Cuba and the United States. I find that she fights back by writing in an ironic and gossipy reframing of oral tradition, ritual history, and mythology fueled by Yemaya y Ochun. Her work importantly creates routes to feminist and LGBTQ+ narratives, histories of Santeria. Her re-representation of the gods with regard to story, sexuality, gender, and presence also included intricate drawings on stones, doodles on notebooks, consecrated beads, and a bedazzled Virgin de Regla. So here is, and I'm thankful to Martin Tseng for this image of Cabrera's sacred ilaques that you see there, one for Yemaya and one for Elegua. And we also have here an image of an exhibit that I was involved with putting together with Martin Tseng, Eric Mayer Garcia, and Kay Turner at the History Miami Museum in 2016 on Lidia Cabrera's story, where we got objects from her archive that I'm alluding to here, and we can see that her archive has much of these material semiotics I've been talking about. Residual transcriptions like the stones, beads, doodles, and statue found here work in Archives of Conjure to produce methodological questions with regard to how we think about the connections between ephemerality, temporality, and material culture. Like the dead in a misa, scholars as ancestors leave clues in the archive on paper and through artifacts, My own search revealed that beading and sewing are referenced and reproduced in papers, objects, and drawings by ancestor scholar practitioners like Lydia Cabrera. And I also look at Ruth Landis's work and her archive and the objects in her archive. And she was an ethnographer who worked with candomblé priestesses in the late 1930s in Bahia, Brazil. These testaments created by scholarly ancestors speak to the importance of materially traced spiritual cartographies. Patterns, colors, stitches, and beads, dolls, and cloth are vital elements to understanding the roads of transformation that residual transcriptions can take in becoming archives of conjure. The literal handiwork of beading or writing left behind by the dead is brought back to life through restitching or rescribbling of the living. Thus, the transgenerational shared labor that occurs in archives of conjure reveals how an element of cyclical flow is central to navigating the very objects found in these repositories. And here's an image of one of Landis's spirit dolls. Studies of material culture in Afro-Latinx religions show how the vernacular arts are rich sources of cultural history, mastery of skill, and individual creativity. Constantly changing, art and material culture in this context act as archives of conjure that respond to past and present afflictions of facing the religious community. They serve devotional purposes in documenting relationships between practitioners and beings in ways that also visibly and invisibly mark the bodies of believers in the forms of objects, scarification, beads, ingested substances, apparel, and so on. For example, Cabrera sanctifies beads, Landis spirit doll here, and Tomas's altar for Shango and Santa Barbara a few slides back all mark spiritual connections created through Afro-Atlantic art. In some cases, objects are made in gratitude, seeking to please and delight divinities and observers alike. What does it mean to look at expressive culture inspired by the residual transcripts created from rituals like the Misa that we see here? This is a spiritual mass or an archive. Can we see, feel, apprehend aspects of spirits in the cloth, smoke, and herbs that they urge participants to use after a ceremony? These questions ask for a change in assumptions on how we conduct ethnographic fieldwork and archival research as well. An approach that embraces the temporal arcs that residual transcriptions and spiritual material culture point to is also able to grasp the cyclical nature of such work. Instead of seeing artifacts and archives as products of one decipherable ephemeral moment, objects like spirit dolls, beaded vessels, and offerings at altars provide invitations for revisiting and renegotiating spiritual connections repeatedly. These relationships are intimate and rely on affective bonds that are relational in nature, yet deeply entrenched in the textures of a racialized historical memory. Here I'm reminded of David H. Brown's observations in his rich and detailed work on Santeria altars, vestments, and adornment. Quote, cloth's associations of loving embrace, spiritual protection, and cleansing are reiterated in Lukumi Ebos, in which they are integral to human divine cycles of gift exchange, end of quote. Ebos are offerings to Afro-Latinx entities. Brown's comments illustrate how cloth, asho in Yoruba, invokes both bonds of affection and memory between devotees and the divine. These bonds draped in cloth and as offerings, as this offering for Eligua is shown here, visibly express extended kinships as archives of conjure, whose textures can tell us volumes about how vernacular history is aesthetically and physically marked by Afro-Latinx religious communities. Through residual transcripts, they point us towards instinctual readings, often shunned due to the deep distrust of feeling and perception and inherited through some discourses of quote-unquote objective analysis that are in and of themselves colored by unchecked Eurocentric prejudices. Yet, feeling through residual readings can bring us closer to the poetics of Afro-Latinx histories and experiences, often ignored in the archive or ignored because of their illegibility, due to a very narrow view of what constitutes a record of the past, of what counts as a story. But how do we read altars, flowing cloth, beaded designs, and the process that create objects dense with meaning and communication? And here is an image of a maso made by Martin Sang, who also did the photo. Martin Sang's recent work on the Chinese influence on Afro-Cuban sacred beading traditions for the divinity Yamaya and Regla Cuba sheds methodological light here. His careful study of the creation of beaded vessels for Yamaya by an elder artisan priest and his apprentices pays attention to the important associations between vessels, the human body, and designs as representative of human divine shared subjectivity. What I take from Sang's attention to the artistic process is an encouraging model for investigating the multiple and changing forms of spirituality that materiality can take. Vessels that hold manifestations of Yamaya, as with expressive works prompted by other spirits' counsels, also require the preparation of designs on paper and several stages of planning and execution. Beading, drawing, and sewing are referenced and reproduced through artists and spirit mediums as tangible testaments to spiritual cartographies. By evaluating a conjured archive that is co-produced by the dead and as well as deities, I conclude that we rethink ethnographic methodologies and frameworks in folklore, anthropology, and perhaps by extension, art history. By conjured here, I mean paying attention to the invention of sites, agents, and affects in conducting research. Reframing ethnographic methods and notations based on vernacular transcription practices also requires asking what kinds of work are notations taken from in ritual context, and what are they meant to do? More than invoking an ethnographic present, such transcriptions on site and in the archive urge the construction of a magical futurity. Once where the transformative properties of conjure are collaboratively harnessed through practices like drawing, sewing, and beading for the continued elaboration of transnational Afro-Latinx histories and communities. And now I'm going to turn to talk a little bit more in detail about the bóveda, or the spirits table. Ritually prepared sites like altares, tronos, and bóvedas are essential components and participants of Afro-Latinx religious performances. These constructions frame liminal spaces where connections to extensive, often ephemeral kin can be developed through multiple performance practices, naming, singing, embodied motion, and further shaping of material culture. The bóveda, or the spirits table, does not symbolize spirits. It does something as them. The elements of water, fire, air, and earth are also present at the table in ways that do work. The bóveda holds art and objects that remember, heal, witness, and resist being forgotten. This allows for medians to have visceral experience of ancestors privately and in communion that also generate new actions and relationships through conjure. Conjure in espiritismo's context are acts of becoming, ontological negotiations between ancestors and mediums' bodies, mediated often through the material culture of the bóveda that makes material memories of race, ethnicity, pain, and migration. Following Fred Moten, sounding blackness occurs in the scream of the objectified that signals a, quote, anamateriality, end of quote, that is, quote, painfully and hiddenly disclosed always and everywhere in the tracks of Black performance, end of quote. Here, Moten illustrates how matter and sound can move through each other through the metaphor of the mother, the mater, with regard to birthing both memory and intergenerational trauma of slavery through Black performance. The ways that mediums and ancestors share bodies, voice, movements, and subjectivities line up with how anamateriality can be understood in this particular Black performative context. Laura E. Pérez's Eros Ideologies, writings on art, spirituality, and the decolonial, creates opportunities for experiencing art in a transformational manner that resonates with Moten's articulation of animateriality. The work's commingling of visual art, poetry, philosophy, prayer, and theory offers exciting methodological modalities. Also stemming from sites of racial and colonial objectification, Pérez shows that Latinx, Indigenous, Latin American, and borderlands expressive cultures work through trauma, healing, and ways of becoming that must contend with gender and sexuality. Also stemming from these sites of racial and colonial objectification, we revisit roadmaps to healing proposed by artists and in the philosophies of Gloria Anzaldúa, Chela Sandoval, Ana Mendieta, Frida Kahlo, and Juana Alicia, among many other necessary visionaries. And Pérez situates this community making within contemplative practices. And this includes doing and engaging with art through a Latina radical imagination that serves as sustenance. Of particular importance is how Eros Ideologies allows us to operate simultaneously within our skins, and that's a quote. In many ways, that also includes the ancestors, spirits, and multiple locations and manifestations of our collective being. As Laura writes about Days of the Dead, walking altars, and Calavera fashion shows in Los Angeles, in the Calavera fashion shows and walking altars, racist, classist, sexist, and homophobic dehumanizations are counteracted, reminding us of the profoundly political, democratizing, and ecological view from the screen is clouding me. The Days of the Dead celebrations arise. That life and death exist in a continuum and are part of the interdependence of all being, the visible and invisible, and humans and non-human. End of quote. Rituals that bring out the dead, like misas, calavera fashion shows, and Walking Day of the Dead altars, necessarily narrate their strategies for resistance and agency in a contiguous other life. These three instances work with the dead and operates art, performance, and ritual within our skins in significant ways. In Espiritismo, lessons to mediums often include descriptions of conjure to be reactivated by the living in a kind of magical pedagogy for fighting against personal and systematic injustice, the creation of art, material culture, and the use of organic medium, pun intended here, are central in most cleansings and protection spells prescribed by ancestor spirits. For example, mediums and other kinds of practitioners can be told to make spirit dolls, cleanse with herbs, and perform other acts of commemoration with and for Afrolatinx spirit guides. These enactments and objects that are produced from them clearly emerge from a Black aesthetics of antimateriality that is also creolized and holds the very tensions found in the historical realities and cultural crossings of Latina Caribbean coloniality. We rely on layered approaches to practice memory and community because of constant persecution, misunderstanding, and disenfranchisement. Rooted in histories of slavery and colonialism, practitioners of the arts and with the dead and deities create innovative ways of never forgetting, actively to fight against white supremacy, patriarchy, and homophobia by making Latina, indigenous, and African-inspired gods, spirits, and things that are constantly being reborn. I now quickly turn to Arturo Lindsay's piece, Celestial Dreaming, shown here, where spirits of departed Afro-Atlantic young men and women bear witness in art by taking up trans-intangible space. Lindsay's collaboration with late African-American playwright Nsojake Shange in his Celestial Dreaming painting series also includes a set of poems by Shange, smoke voices, interviews with the spirits in the art of Arturo Lindsay. The project vivifies Black lives ended through violence in words as well as portraits of angelic constellations. The angelic figures look back at the viewer in a manner that inspires recognition and testimony. The celestial journeys of spirits murdered by young murdered young Black men and women take the forms of hearts and patterns of light. Lindsay related to me that this work situates a belief in reincarnation and return. Visually, it asks us to confront the existential consequences of deeply and blindly divided political and public culture, and holding this gaze requires work from the interstices, a place of in-betweenness and connection. Work at the Bóveda similarly marks the multiple biographies and sojourns of the dead and the living who come to the table at the interstices. Whether they be accessed by spirits or mediums, the art and material culture found on the Bóveda work like memory objects in that they evoke past and significant social relations of kins, friends, and colleagues. Guides and practitioners certainly share kinship based on this intertwining of art, objects, stories, and selves. These elements combined shape the destinations and fellow companions present during the metaphysical travel that happens at Latina and Afro-Latinx sites of art and spirit making. Here I am reminded of Jose Esteban Muñoz's suggestion that a brown sense of the world allows for a, quote, flowing into the common that nonetheless maintains the urgencies and intensities we experience as freedom and difference, end of quote. As with Tomas's dead that started this presentation, I'm asking that we sit and pay attention to the many ecologies of being that surround us. What can paying attention to the dead and their accompanying environs really do? I believe it compels us to act ethically within a larger focus of the cycle of becoming that includes endings and mysteries. The study of folk religion, vernacular, and belief is layered with evidence of how especially women and LGBTQ plus people create connections to spiritual entities and leave traces as residuals for future generations to conjure. Through unfinished notes and vague instructions, we are asked to creatively connect and complete projects that in themselves will need to be recontextualized to stay present and alive. Ultimately, we find that there is a constant dialogue waiting to be ignited through our intuition, imagination, and intent. Through collaborative engagement, we can learn from how Afro-Latinx communities of practice follow their spirits in their daily lives to create art, scholarship, and change in the face of sexual intolerance, racism, and xenophobia. This work can be many things at once and take on multiple forms. Like the sea or the rivers, it can flow and transport us in different directions of discovery and recognition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solimar, for that wonderful presentation. There are so many very powerful thoughts that I would love to get to in our Q&A, especially this idea of magical futurities. I think it's very necessary and also very appealing for thinking about different ways in which we could move forward as a society. Now I will introduce Laura Pérez, who is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies and chair of the Latinx Research Center at the University of California in Berkeley. She holds a PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from Harvard University and is the author of Eros Ideologies, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial, and Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities, both published by Duke University Press in 2019 and 2007, respectively. I have to say that your book, Chicana Alterities, Professor Pérez, was really inspiring for me during my first years of my master's program and PhD program at Columbia. And it has been a really powerful, inspirational driving force for my academic writing. So I'm really happy to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Dr. Alvero, the Department of Art History and Archaeology, and ISLAA, and a very warm thank you to Professor Solimar Otero right now for that really beautiful, beautiful and creative and inspiring companion presentation. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you from the preface in order to make for you the connections that are in the subtitle of my book, Eros Ideologies, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial. And then I'm going to hop over and pick out a few parts to read to you about a chapter that looks at the work of Guatemalan-American and LA-based artist Alex Dones. So empezaré. So pleasure to be with all of you. Eros Ideologies is a collection of writings that explores the possibilities for individual and social shifts that move us beyond either or binaries, beyond us versus them mentalities that dehumanize us all. In the end, I'm not so much interested in who is to blame for racism, sexism, homophobia, abuse, and violence against women and our planet, and so on, but in what continues to drive such mistaken orderings so that we might think and act beyond them. The arts are among the most valuable laboratories for creating new relevant forms of thought, often signaled by aesthetic innovation in their own nonverbal form. Experimentation in an artwork's form allows us to not only imagine things differently, but also to experience from a new perspective, to see that a new perspective is possible. Ideas about how things ideas about how things should be are received from the cradle as cultural assumptions. The work of reflecting on these, on cultural assumptions, and when necessary, rethinking these into new, personally and socially healthier directions is a socially significant act of exercising personal power. And it's a gift because social change begins with innovation, creativity, transformation in our own. that creativity is a vein of gold in all walks of life, and not only in that of the artist, is suggested by common enough ideas like life as an art, artfulness, and so on. It is claimed as the secret of highly successful entrepreneurs in best-selling book after book. From spiritual and psychological perspectives, creativity is an enriching path toward greater personal authenticity, a way of discovering beyond socially received conventions what feels most appropriate in the continuing shifting landscape of our lives. More collectively, through creativity, we help envision and produce the neighborhoods, the cities, countries, and planet that we can enjoy in good conscience because they're more just and not the product of the suffering of others. Learning to listen to our inner promptings, to trust our proverbial gut, to be, that is, to feel, think, and act as feels right for us. Practice that integrates and synchronizes body, mind, and spirit by whatever name we call the incommensurable, the enigmatic, and the unknowable in the natural world of which we form part. Eros Ideologies joins company with those writing and thinking visually about mind, body, spirit integration. This integration, I want to argue, is vital to decolonization. To the writings of spiritual teachers and healing professionals who follow spiritual practices from African diasporic, Buddhist, Hindu, Native American, and Western traditions, I add further reflections toward better understanding the decolonial as intensely embodied, personal, psychological, and spiritual practice alongside cultural, economic, and geopolitical work. Sigmund Freud's concept of the superego, the normative authority figure complex internalized through parents and other authority figures, made clear already to the generation following him, that of another great psychiatrist, Carl Jung, and certainly to the generation that followed of Frantz Fanon, Michel Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari, that the psyche is the prime field on which ideologies of domination are rationalized as natural or so-called normal. And this is where they first take root. The psyche was therefore key to these thinkers to gaining greater freedom, personal well-being, and self-realization, and was intimately related to external struggles for social justice and world peace. Decolonial thought and practice seeks to understand, to move beyond, in a word, to heal the wounding caused by the dehumanizing, fragmenting effects of the racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, patriarchy, and human centrism that we inherit through histories of colonization of the Americas, as elsewhere in the so-called Third World. But while many seeking human and social well-being observed the crucial place of psychology in social action theories, even the psychiatrist and anti-colonial guerrilla fighter Fanon was still immersed in European philosophy and knowledges, unable under the reign of materialist science to make use of other planetary philosophies and their differing worldviews of the nature and purpose of being. We are still immersed in literature, art, philosophy, science, popular culture, and so-called common sense that still transmit pernicious views of human beings based on the color of our skin, ancestral cultures, gender, sexuality, class, legal status, religion, and so on. In these writings, often in dialogue, even when indirectly so, with the images of artworks that accompany them, I depart from a cross-cultural, philosophical, spiritual thought of the indigenous Americas, the Buddhist, the Hindu, and the African diasporic, that instead explore unity and difference as potentially simultaneous and harmonious realities. The human person as continually changing and productively and through respectful contact with people from all cultures and walks of life. In such thought, neither body nor sexuality in its multiple possible expressions, including the queer, is demonized, nor is intellect supervalorized in hierarchical difference to the emotional or physical bodies. I joined company in such a project with US women of color thinkers and artists who have insisted on the reality and political and social importance of spirituality in dialogue with non-Western and hybrid Western and non-Western thought regarding the nature and purpose of being. Women of color intellectuals such as Ansaldúa, Paula Ganellan, Chela Sandoval, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Lila Fernandez, Latamani, Jackie Alexander are some of the decolonial thinkers who have labored to shift our understanding of being, freedom, justice, and power in deep dialogue with non-Western spiritual philosophies of the interdependence of all life forms. I also aim beyond badly outdated and imbalanced ideologies centered in materialist philosophies, knowledge, and politics of left and right. What is necessary, it seems to me, is the surviving living wisdom of culturally diverse people from every corner of our country and globe. In these diverse, culturally specific, and yet tellingly resonant ancient bodies of knowledge that have survived millennia of human destruction into the present, we find what I can only describe as a different reason based on deeper understandings of human and planetary realities. I strive to reimagine a sense of communal relationship and care for self, other, and planet, an eros and an ideology centered in that eros, attentive to what our indigenous, African, Asian, and ancient European ancestors taught as common wisdom, and that elders from those cultures have been given for human and planetary safekeeping. Transmitted through millennia, we have with us highly intelligent, reality-based, deeply compassionate bodies of thought for the creation and maintenance of lives aimed at genuinely free, realized, peaceful, creative, and meaningful existence. Guided by such thought, and mostly following the spirit of Audre Lorde and Chela Sandoval, I write of the erotic, understood in its broadest sense, and not simply sexually, as respectful relationship and care for self and others. That is, as a socially and politically significant practice of love that is creative of authentic self, and in so doing, simultaneously world-making. Such practice of the erotic is politically ideological in its aim of individual and social transformation toward greater democratic freedom and well-being. Unlike materialist political ideologies of historically recent vintage of the left and right, still laboring under mechanistic and materialist notions of the human, the social, and planetary bodies, Eros ideologies define being through the body, feeling, and culturally multiple forms of reason that are non-dualistic. The Eros ideological is premised on the interdependent, multiple, and changing nature of identities and being in a unified field of existence that is characterized by the plurality of created forms or life. The effectiveness and longevity of a social and political practice is more firmly rooted, I want to argue, in self-awareness and self-love. That is, respect and care for our own being as constantly changing, shifting, transforming, self-revealing, increasingly self-aware amalgam of body, mind, and spirit, which is unavoidably a work in progress. Studying literary, visual, and performance arts for nearly 4 decades and spirituality for 2. In Eros Ideologies, writings on art, spirituality, and the decolonial, I write from a mind tutored by something more than an intellect, corralled by the tautologies of materialist empiricism. I write in an embodied practice and not solely a mental one. I research, reflect, think, feel, and write, seeking truth, greater understanding of reality, and well-being beyond the intellectual, culturally limited, and indeed neo-colonizing, Eurocentric, patriarchal, and heteronormative strictures that still dominate much of academic and mainstream intellectual cultures. I feel as I think, and I write from yearning, from the unnameable, the barely known that I brush against when I take intuition, insight, dreams, and hope seriously. To put it in the terms of psychiatrist Claudio Naranjo in Healing Civilization, I strive to write beyond patriarchy's patristic shadow side, its hierarchical, emotionless performance of anonymous objectivity, and instead to think and feel from its positive manifestation as philia, the love of and respect for things and people, and for wisdom and not just data and fact. In his three-part model of the healthy human psyche, Naranjo identifies the caring and compassionate function of the psyche as the matristic second form of love known in ancient Greek literature and in traditional religious writings of the West is agape. He identifies the undomesticated elements in instinct, desire, and the natural promptings of the body, and the playful creative spirit with the childlike eros. Naranjo's model of well-being is psychological, spiritual, and social, and rooted in the capacity of humans to express three of love's functions: to respect, to care, to be happy: philia, agape, and eros. The healthy human psyche, and by extension, the healthy human society, are characterized in Naranjo by a harmonious balancing of these three types of expressions of being human. Essentially, healthy humanness is characterized by Naranjo as the integration of different ways of loving or caring that begins with the self within one's own psyche and body, and therefore it can genuinely extend to others. In my work, Eros Ideologies do not just describe the instinctual, the creative, and the playful, the still unfully domesticated or socialized aspects that are specifically identified with the function of Eros by Naranjo and described by Freud as the libidinal. But they are central to art, and they are the possibilities as they are to the possibilities of personal self-realization and political transformation. As suggested by the subtitle of this book, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial, erotic energy and power in the intention and capacity to relate deeply and respectfully across differences, and receptivity to the unknown or different are at the heart of the potentially positive, transformative work that art, spirituality, and the decolonial can do. The great nonviolent anti-colonial activist Mohandas K. Gandhi repeatedly described God as truth and love. Mesoamerican indigenous sages added creativity to that troika. The creative is the creative in the creator and characterizes life. I do not fully understand the relationship between art, creativity, love, and the well-lived personal and social life, nor do I think it possible to do so fully. However, I do feel, perceive, think, and know that they are intimately connected. This collection of writings is unified across a plurality of writing styles and voices, from the literary, journalistic, heavily annotated academic text, to the curatorial essay, to more hybrid poetic theorizations and philosophical poems, from creative, critical reflection to emotional gesture and autobiographical meditation. There are 21 chapters, some quite short and evocative, some thicker and denser, and together they are meandering paths of what I lovingly offer as a garden of fruitful heart thought. Eros ideologies may be entered anywhere, any one of these chapters. Nevertheless, as they are arranged, the chapters flow one to the other, together and cumulatively deepening and returning to the core themes announced in the title and sketched out here. The table of contents, therefore, is also composed of thumbnail images that point toward the heart of each chapter. My aim through such a structure is to practice myself writing and reflection as a plentiful garden, a coexistence of different forms of knowing and expressing, a welcoming and integrating into the processes of thought and analyses, feelings, intuitions, hope, and faith in the verdant power of creativity and of Eros to make ourselves a way forward toward greater flowering of individual, collective, and planetary well-being. To kind of ground that a little bit, I wanted to just hop in these last few minutes of the presentation to chapter 9, which is called Thea Erotics in Alex Donis's My Cathedral. Alex Donis is an artist, a Guatemalan-American artist who is based in Los Angeles, and his work is repeatedly examining queer Latinx themes. The chapter is based on my reflections of his show, which happened in 1997 at the Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco's historic Mission District. The windows of the gallery, which are like any glass storefront, were repeatedly broken because this type of an image was reflected. Some of the couples that were represented in the exhibition, and so at night they were also glowing because they were presented on light boxes. So throughout the day and night you could see these pieces. So for example, here you have, these are entitled, you have Jesus and Lord Rama. There were also images of Martin Luther King and a Klansman, Madonna and Mother Teresa. As you see here, Pope John Paul II and Gandhi, Che Guevara and Cesar Chavez. Each of these paired iconic figures, garbed in their signature costumes, were shown in erotic embrace, single-pointedly kissing. They were damaged by objects thrown through the window, and they were replaced, and then altars were created in the street in front of them. And the gallery was very supportive of the artist. When you entered the exhibition, the gallery had been transformed into a cathedral-like space with a U-shaped plexiglass, huge, like 18-foot, 20-foot long apse, of translucent plexiglass sheets that again repeated these kinds of pairings and included others such as Queen Elizabeth making out with an indigenous woman, Mao Zedong and the Dalai Lama, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, Hitler and a man from Africa, Columbus and an indigenous man, Mary Magdalene and the Virgen de Guadalupe. So you had this multicolored text, and then you had this continual sound loop. The Mexican bolero, Bésame, Bésame mucho, in the background, kiss me a lot, and then pleasurable exclamations. You had ooh, ay, and these were also written on the plexiglass, and splashes of color were also like dropped throughout this plexiglass installation, spoofing the idea of stained glass, but also the idea of love juices, which were throughout. There was also a repetitive loop of pleasurable moaning sounds, I see, that then morphed into a sissy, as in sissy, and a sissy. Donis's work explored the limits of the politics of love and liberation in leftist, nationalist, and religious discourses. The borders of art and the spiritual were blurred in the show through a common politics of love. In transgressing the limits of religious and diverse political ideological discourses of liberation, Donis exposed their rather lame and contradictory claims to being a politics of love. He seemed to ask, what would history and culture have been if MLK Jr. and the Klan, if Kennedy and Castro, Madonna and Mother Teresa embraced and erotically? What effect would a politics of love that could openly express itself as homo or gynoerotic have had on the histories of struggle and violence that define patriarchal and heterosexist cultures? My cathedral spoke to history and political opposition through an erotic politics rooted in the nonviolence of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Dalai Lama, the latter of whom was quoted at the entrance of the show in the gallery. Anyone who puts all their energy into destroying anger will be happy in his life and in lives to come. In my cathedral, Donis pursued as natural rather than unnatural the fluidity between spirituality, eros, and politics, and challenged intolerant notions of community in each of these spheres to practice what they preach. The hybrid crossings, especially religious, in Donis's show foregrounded gender, sexual, and cultural liaisons. Personified as Jesus and Rama, Christianity and Hinduism on the one hand, and two men in the other, were shown in intimate loving contact. Eros, both emotional and sexual, was the underlying zone. The sacred itself in Donis's My Cathedral is hybrid, crossing religious leaders, popular cultural icons, and social justice heroes. The good and even the bad met and mingled in a third space. Donis's images suggested that his cathedral is love itself, that which escapes and confounds and contradicts and leads by the nose religious and ideological dogma. Love itself is the radical signifier, the energy of constant slippage and loopholes, the fund of that which can never be colonized, and from which we resist neo-colonization and oppression of human device, in contrast to the fluidity, variety, and constant hybridity in movement of nature, and therefore of human nature as well. Love's realm of performance, the erotic, is a practice, not merely an idea, nor an ideal, or a guiding principle, but rather an energy, a politics, present in its various forms of enactment, whether intention and thought, feeling, touch, or other act forms. My cathedral performed not only as an Eros ideology that challenged self-designated revolutionary, radical, and democratic ideologies to envision the dismantling of racism and the hatred that breeds it, by embracing interracial love, homoeroticism, and love across the wounds of racism, such that following Gandhi, we refuse to, quote unquote, dehumanize the dehumanizer. Donis's culturally hybrid spirituality and gender hybrid sexuality also manifested themselves in an Eros ideology that is a politics of love tested at its present day limits. Together, the erotic spiritual politics of my cathedral were, in effect, salves to heal the wounds of mutually exclusive binary oppositions, whether cross-racial hostility, male versus female dislike, straight versus queer distrust, one form of queerness or over another, or as Ansaldúa put it, whatever part of ourselves is policing another part of ourselves. From this perspective, Donis's installation was both a barometer of the visionary within our time and place and an inquiry into the limits of love, an inquiry into the meaning of sanctity, of the role of the material via the body and sexual expression in the spiritual. And finally, it was an inquiry into the degree to which all these categories are identified with each other, are somehow connected, and through each other function. What this bold, brave, and insightful body of work by Alex Donis envisioned is community as communion among its varied, non-identical elements in pairings predicated on a remainder that cannot be erased, for it is our common essence, the erotic, which perforce is the sacred. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really wonderful. And thank you, Solimar, for your presentation. Laura, I think your focus on self-awareness and self-love is something that we can all really hold on to right now, and something that we all need. I especially think am using this in my practice, and I really value your focus on poetics and the poetics of love in many ways. So we're going to start the discussion now. Julian and myself will be asking a few questions of Dr. Pérez and Dr. Otero, and then we will open up the floor to some questions from the Q&A. So we wanted to start out with just a kind of bit of a broader question connecting your two works, because your works are very different, but there's a lot of linkages and a lot of cross currents here. So I wanted to ask, how do your conceptions of the spiritual function on a broader scale? So this is for the both of you.
So I'll jump in, very, very briefly, and then would love to hear you. But what I think the reason I want to jump in right away is because I think that the first level for me is being able as scholars, right, is being able to take seriously the spiritual beliefs of people, whether they're Christians, but especially if they are traditions like the Afro-diasporic or the traditional indigenous or Buddhist or other spiritualities, because I think that the histories of colonization and the Darwinian hierarchical labeling of the belief systems, which are philosophies, their worldviews, and their spiritualities. They're both philosophies and spiritualities. I think that these are already demonized, and at best, they're viewed as being primitive. So, para empezar, for me, empezamos con, it's not a question of my opinions, other than that as a scholar, that I think that true objectivity and the desire to grow knowledge for the future in the way that we've inherited knowledge means the capacity to, in a decolonial way, to cut through these very racist and Eurocentric inventions that have tried to categorize the philosophies and belief systems of non-Western peoples and us as Latinos who inherit hybrid art forms. So to begin with, spirituality means to me philosophy, worldview, and something that is very important for us to create a way to speak about with respect. So if we haven't had spiritual experiences, to me, it's simply irrational and intellectually weak to therefore say spirituality doesn't exist, right? And the kinds of spirituality that our practitioners, our elders embody. So it means that to me, para empezar. Segundo, muy brevemente, as I pointed out in the preface, I think that part of the colonial experience and the construction of the domination of Western thought has involved dividing body, mind, spirit, and even within the West, devaluing the knowledges that we call spiritual or psychic, that belong to the psyche, the soul, the emotions. And so I think that it's important for us to explore these areas when we're thinking about the search for greater truths and the search for how to live respectfully with each other and the planet. So thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you for that question. And Laura, thank you for such a wonderful presentation and for, answering that question in a manner that I really not only agree with, but I would even further say that there's a reason why certain kinds of spiritualities, especially spiritualities of those people who've been colonized or put into slavery, have been demonized, because those spiritualities were considered dangerous. They're considered, and they were recognized as being antithetical to the kind of epistemological and taxonomical constructions that the colonialist enterprise was trying to do. So let's just think of the Haitian Revolution as an example, right? So the fear of Blackness, the fear of indigeneity, the fear of heterogeneity as well, the mixedness of us as Latinos, as coming from Creolized traditions. I think that very much there's a power there, and that power was recognized, and because of that, it's been demonized. That's kind of my sense of it. And in terms of spirituality, I don't see how you can separate spirituality from materiality. I mean, in terms of the experiences that I've seen in my field work, and even the desire to separate is very intentional, right? Because it's doing certain kinds of ideological work. So I see this kind of this rethinking of the spiritual as necessary. That's why I use the term from Donna Haraway, material semiotics, as necessarily embroiled and embedded in different forms of matter and different forms of materiality. That's why I talk about Moten's anti-materiality, because materiality has to be vivified in some ways, and so it's not an either or. I am totally non-binary as well. I think it's a flowing through. So yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me to not include it. So,
and I would also, gracias Soli for that those really insightful comments as well. I would, I also just want to say that when I started studying visual art and literature performance, I was just, according to me, I mean, there was my private life, right? But according to me, I was really doing something about trying to do like a recuperation and to write in an entire generation that was written out of art history, and less so to literature, let alone to performance art. But what I found is that the artists themselves kept on insisting on spirituality. And so I realized it would be a violence to the work to pick and choose what felt to me. And it did not feel safe to me at the beginning to be investigating spirituality. I thought, yo qué pitos estoy tocando acá? I personally that stereotype of people of color, especially women of color and spirituality,
right, yeah,
was already there to discredit us. So it was a journey of sort of like, and why am I afraid when I think I'm such a big bad feminist, and investigating the fear became part of the way of being able to really analyze where those like danger zones that dominant culture had constructed were. So it was in the work.
Yeah, they want to construct those danger zones, because Anzaldúa, that's the spirituality is kind of what puts it all together in some ways, right? And so that danger zone is because that danger zone can't be codified in the ways that need to be codified. So I think that that's, you know, the fluidity of the danger zone is what's kind of frightening to these structures, right? And absolutely, yeah, and it's in the work. It's in the work. It's in the poetry. It's in the art. It's in the performance.
I love what your point right now about entering the danger zone, right? And you're bringing back Anzaldúa's idea of like the richness of this very like tabooed marginal zone, that in it is all of this wealth, right? And all of this truth and the source of more real epistemologies, right? More real ways of understanding meaning. Yeah, totally right on. Yeah.
Yeah, and with the work that I do, where you're cohabiting with either the dead or with ancestors or deities, and that cohabitation, I think you mentioned intensely embodied. This intensely embodiment is multiple subjectivities that also includes vasos de agua, glasses of water, or soperas. And so there is like not only consciousness, but the materiality that's shared is also creates these other connections. And that can be very, very dangerous and frightening to epistemologies where there's this definite split between the mind and the body and the spirit, and everything's supposed to be where it's supposed to be. Yeah, so I think that that embracing the danger zone, I think, is necessary.
Yeah, we had a few more questions regarding that specific line of conversation that you were building, which I think is really fascinating, that relates specifically to this idea of spirituality as a form of activism, which, you know, ties up directly with Gloria Anzaldúa's writings and work, and, you know, her own embodied experience as a Chicana writer, moving in between different worlds, right? So how do you personally you know, tie up that notion of spiritual activism within your own work? Laura, you've mentioned something about feminism, and Solimar, in your book, you also mentioned in several different occasions, there's actually one chapter dedicated only to the LGBTQ community and drag performers, which I think is really fascinating. So activism through the means of spirituality as a way to make an actual transformation, a material transformation in the way that we live the world, that we inhabit the world, that we understand the world. I think it's a very powerful notion because it's not necessarily tied up to the more economic or politically oriented, like in the traditional terms of understanding politics, a political oriented way of looking at social and community action. So I just wanted to you know, dig a little bit further on the notion of spiritual activism with you.
I can go real quick. I was thinking, right, when you were talking, Julian, about it's the actual, because I was talking about misas espirituales, los muertos, they come and they tell you what's going on in your life, but they comment, they're beings that come from history. They might be former slaves, they might be indigenous spirits, they might represent all different kinds of components. So we can't forget history in this kind of spirituality and the performance and the art of that performance, and what it means. And I would say, for example, for me, actually looking at an ofrenda, like the ones I showed, or even looking at the beautiful work of Martin Sang's Mazos, you know, looking at that beautiful beadwork and thinking of that as a kind of activism, because within those offerings, some are more ephemeral, others are carried around, there are coded histories and stories and sustenance and resistance. So the fact that these offerings are there, the fact that these objects exist, resist, persist, I feel it's in itself, it's in the work, it's in the actual object, because they represent so many different layers of history, and also of becoming, and they ask for engagement. So
that's great. you know, one of the things that I really love about your work, Soli, is you just introduced so many super, super rich concepts, and they're really necessary for being able to like think about embodiment and thinking about like the presence, the immanence, right, of helping us all to think, you know, as in African diasporic philosophical traditions, spiritual traditions and practices, of that saturation, as you said a few moments ago. The material has to be vivified, right? And so I think that spiritual activism, including in the way that Ansaldúa, I think, was trying to work towards, in Borderlands, like her first big work, she talked about like works, and she thought of her book as a work of art. She talked about works that are about virtuosity. Like, oh, you can draw better than anyone, you can write better than anyone. These are works of virtuosity, versus works that she thought were alive. And she took that idea from many places, but one of them was through a book that studied African masks and the idea that the objects were embodied with spirit. And so I think part of what she was trying to grope at through the concept of spiritual activism is that our politics, our activism, are centered in a worldview that embraces spiritual views that begin with the idea that, as Ansaldúa says in Borderlands, the work is alive, la tengo que bañar, la tengo que vestir, como si el trabajo, as if the work were an altar. And in that sense, like thinking about that, we are led to thinking about intentionality, right? Spiritual activism is about the intention that we have when we direct any of our actions, whether it's through prayer, whether it's through the construction of altares or ceremony or ritual, or whether it's to make a work. And I would say whether it's to make an artwork or whether it's to make a scholarly work, ¿verdad?
Oh, una poesía, like, you know, and that's exactly, and I think that's why I love Borderlands. There's so much there, and it's no mistake that there's poetry for Yemaya in Borderlands, right? And Yemaya being the great mother of the sea, but also the deity that takes care of LGBTQ populations transnationally. That's knowledge that people know if they're part of the community and stuff. And I think that brings me back to your work, Laura, and how necessary Eros is, how necessary the sensual is, how necessary the embracing of that powerful energy to this work of healing, as opposed to maybe in other traditions where the sensual, especially when it's related to, you know, women or LGBTQ communities, that is a suspect. But the sensual and the body being a source of healing and a source of really thinking through how spirituality and art can come together. I think that's very powerful, and I think that's in Ansaldúa as well.
I think this is a great place to move actually into our next question. And thank you both for such thoughtful answers. I think it's interesting, having read both of your books, to see how your writing is so much reflects your voices in so many ways. And it's really a delight. But I wanted to really focus also thinking about how both of your works really deeply engage with personal, intimate experiences with objects, with ritual and spirituality. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how can personal intricacies and entanglements enrich our understandings of spirituality and art.
Well, I think I'll take a stab. Solimar, yo empiezo, le doy un poco de gas. I think that, you know, one of the reasons why I have so many voices and so many chapters, some really small, some long, you know, has to do with recognizing that we understand, we think, we perceive, receive, call, invoke knowledge, media, you know, and when we study multiple media, the way I do, multiple art media, it becomes very clear that you know, they speak in different ways, right? Whether it's performance art speaking through the body, whether it's a different kind of a visual art speaking through the visual, the spatial, whether it's writing, right? Speaking through word choice or disposition on a page, or even ink choices, things like that. And I think that we're like that too. And so I think that in a way, it's like thinking of ourselves as a kind of a box of, you know, multiple colored pens. Sometimes we write with the orange ink, sometimes with the blue ink, you know. Sometimes some of the most important insights that we have come when you're going for a beautiful walk. Sometimes they come at night, you know. And so it's part, for me, it's a project, the intimate and the personal, and welcoming it against all of these like stereotypes that we can, that again, the person of color speaking through the autobiographical, not being theoretical enough. When our stories have been so silenced and so twisted, they're projected onto us. There aren't archives. There aren't enough archives. And so we and our experience become the bases of the collecting of one human set of truths. And so in that sense, the personal is a really important barometer for truth. You know, in the same way that when you're listening to somebody, your insight might say, pues no lo creo. I don't buy that. There's something, you may not have the argument at that moment, but you just don't buy it. And so this is like, to me, is more this practice of mind, body, spirit, trusting, you know, that our body has things to say, whether they're like gorgeously, you know, theoretical, or instead gorgeously like perceptive and felt. So para empezar, there's certainly, it's a beautiful question. So much could be said here. Thank you for that question.
Gracias, Laura. Para empezar, muy bien. You started it very well. And I love the structure of the book, your book, because I felt that rhythm and that flow, and it was inspiring. I mean, I was so excited to not have to read, you know, a monograph that had all the things checked in, because there's a kind of violence in that. And I talk about that in the larger book, Archives of Conjure. This idea that there's some sort of objective view when you're looking at art, or you're looking at culture, when you're doing this work, that's a privileged point of view, right? That this objective, you know, omnipotent perspective that comes from, that's cultured, that's raced, that's gendered, and that comes from a specific place of, again, colonial taxonomies. I mean, this view goes right to those histories of colonization and the construction of fields like anthropology and folklore and sexual studies, especially in the 19th century. So I always go back to like these categories of what objective is. So in order to put something in a box, you have to be coming from a position where you feel like you're superior to that. In any case, so I got off that soapbox. In terms of the personal, I think that Laura's comments made me think about residual transcriptions. I actually was when I first started writing Archives of Conjure 10 years ago, I was very hesitant to talk about personal experiences that I eventually talked about, whether it's my own spiritual experiences or issues of grief, or, you know, conversations with people in my family. I was very, you know, it was something that I had to learn to embrace. And what helped me learn to embrace it was actually the scholarly ancestors, people like Lydia Cabrera and Ruth Landis, when I was in their archive and looking at the intimate poetry and drawings and notes and the scribbled notes on the side of a calling card that tells you something about that moment, and that personal, that real personal connection, that residual left there, that made me say, well, you know, I'm gonna be a bullshitter if I don't open up. Here I am going to be talking about these, you know, this very personal and this very, very intimate life. The people's papers in an archives are intimate, you know, and being able to think about that. And so I had to give myself permission to talk about my intimacies and my own personal connections to the work I was doing in order to ethically work with Lydia Cabrera's and Ruth Landis's material. I feel like that, for me, they were the ones who taught me, as well as the Muertos and the Santos and all of the other interlocutors in my religious experiences and in the community that I'm a part of. Also kind of keeps you honest, I guess.
I just want to pipe in and say, to me, Sol, I think one of the numerous like innovations that's in your work that I really appreciate and that is helpful to me is the way in which you are making it possible to speak about our communion with the ancestors. Like in spiritual practices, that is so core, right, to the Afro-diasporic and to the indigenous. It is also to the Buddhist, right, and the Hindu. And so how, for us, I mean, I just think it's fabulous the way that you're talking about, you know, the spirits, the Egun, being present and being co-creators. And in terms of the question, the intimacy of familia that doesn't end with the flesh, right? But with another form of presence, no? So I think that's another way to think about that.
Yeah, that's why that when I was the quote I took from your book, I had to include it in my presentation, because that's exactly the kind of entanglement and interaction that about the Day of the Dead walking altars, that's kind of situated, right? You're saying that it's a continuum, you know, and I think that that's absolutely that those are deeply held beliefs, and this is not something that's being, you know, pressed upon from top down. This is how people create sustenance and understand community. The community also includes people who've passed on, right? So
we get, you know, a lot of people begin sort of like in the Bay Area with Days of the Dead. It's like such a cool, hip thing, right? Because it was like recreated, but it really addressed the needs that people had, right? Not only to grieve, but to get help from our dead. And as people kind of reflect on their experiences, they realize que la abuelita, the grandmother, is, you know, always talking, or maybe the mother or the father, talking about their own dead, which are our dead, but que les van a pedir ayuda, right? They're gonna van a prender una velita, you know, for the grandmother who's been dead, so that from the other side they can help. So these are things like that are alive in our community, and it seems to me to be so incredibly disrespectful, even if we don't have these practices, to view these things simply like as a caricatura, as a caricature, right? Like, all those people, they're so cute, haha, you know, as if they're just stupid. And I think it creates, especially for Latinos that might have these backgrounds, it creates a distancing between ourselves and our families if we're kind of taught to disregard the spiritual beliefs and practices that are ancestral and ancient.
you're absolutely right. I think that exchange, that kinship is vital, the continuation of that kinship. And, you know, in the archives, a lot of our history isn't there, right? So in terms of what Archives of Conjure can do, or this kind of continuation of these vernacular archives, Day of the tradiciones de Día de los Muertos, igual como las tradiciones de hacer una misa espiritual, is actually really doing very important work in the now that is about like a historical imaginary that's also healing. And when I say imaginary, I don't mean it's not real. I just mean it's creative and doing work across bodies and minds, right? So absolutely.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question to what you were saying earlier, Solimar, which I thought was really fascinating. And it's the fact that there's so much lost in the process of translation, right, of certain languages to other languages. And in my personal experience, you know, training as a doctoral student in a very strict kind of academic writing in English, being a non-English speaker, native speaker, really it requires a really complicated exercise of changing the structures in which you were born and raised, into a different thing. And then like thinking about the translation process, but then from languages that are not necessarily linguistic in terms of like, you know, you can write them and speak them. You know, there's so much, it's a very fertile ground for exploration. I think it's very interesting. I had a question for both of you that I'm really fascinated by, interested in, and it's this interspiritual conversation that both of you engage with in your work. This notion that through the connection of different spiritual systems, there are underlying truths or valuable pieces of knowledge that we can explore as a way to enrich our lives, but also create a positive impact in the world around us. Is something that I have been also trying to incorporate in my own work, and I think it's there's so much there that can be said and done. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is, how do you methodologically and theoretically smooth those differences between different spiritual systems so that it makes sense to put it in a kind of like narrative or rhetoric for your own work?
I don't. Because you've seen the work with the Spiritismo. Spiritismo is a very unorthodox framework, and that's why I was very interested in the combination of a Catholic nun walking with a Gitana, walking with a Congo, walking with. So I was really interested in what the tensions, what the dissonances of bringing together all that messiness in spiritual practice, what that can teach us about understanding how narratives don't have to be boiled down into one. What can living with that messiness, living with that tension, living with those different entities and histories that can't be boiled down to one happy story, right? In terms of slavery and colonialism and immigration and different components. And so it was hard, but I've decided to sit with the messiness and convey that in the work as well as I can. It's very difficult to do, but it's more organic to what it would be violent if I was to try to make, one narrative that would make sense to either, and I love Lauro's work about different aspects of different ideologies of politics and wanting these easy narratives and how that is based on heteropatriarchal notions of nation and revolution and stuff like that. So, to answer your question, I don't think I do. I don't.
I would just add to that first of all, I think that the messiness, the realness that Sol is talking about is important, and it happens, I think, when you're looking at visual, cultural, or other creative practices. I think that the kind of specificity that we're required to bring to, if you were looking at a medieval artist, of one country, of Germany, it would really not be appropriate to skip, right, studying what the cultural historical context of that was, and to just kind of assume that early 20th century is going to cut it, so I think that every piece is sort of asking us to, when we bother to look at it for whatever reason, it's asking us to try as best we can from our own horizon without trying to project, oh, you should be like me today because I'm so woke, but trying to understand what were its reference, right? And so for us as Latinos and Latino art, we often see a kind of mixture, right, of reference that are cultural and very often also spiritual. So in a general answer, I would say then being present to the honesty, the intellectual honesty of doing our best to understand, why is there a little dark cauldron in here? What does that mean? And I'm going to give two really fast examples. And one is this very atrocious essay that accompanied by a curator in Germany that accompanied an exhibition catalog. And when this woman was looking at the significance of the monkey and the cat in Frida Kahlo, such a well-known artist, in her self-portrait, this poor woman, what she did is she referred, in fact, to the history of Western medieval imagery to talk about that these things signified Kahlo's witchiness and the dark sexual urges that she had, and hello, is this invent your interpretation day? And igual con Ana Mendieta, right, and her performance art, to ignore what Ana Mendieta, why she's using blood, right, or why she's mixing human body with earth, and to just dismiss that from a completely Western perspective is about privilege, dominant cultural privilege, and the lack of humility, the lack of honesty to say, pues yo no entiendo why they're using blood here. Let me try to investigate who this woman Ana Mendieta was, or Frida Kahlo. And so, I think the work that deals with spirituality is fascinating. Why do these incredible artists that are as artists, they're continually misunderstood within a Euro tradition. And for them then to choose reference that are outside of what they've been trained to do, right, is really significant. It's on par when you're making a reference that is aesthetic and philosophical, that is outside of the Western tradition. To me, that's on par with, like, you know, Cubism deciding it's not going to make a traditional representation. It's significant from a cultural point of view. And our challenge is that we still are operating within Eurocentric and neocolonial assumptions. So no es igual to just be talking about any kind of work. It's very racialized and complicated by imperialism and colonialism, aesthetically.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, because I think that's quite right, you know, and this it's kind of this reticence to go into we talked about the danger zone. The art itself has the danger zone in it, right? In terms of the spirituality. And I think that the deliberate, well, maybe not deliberate, but the kind of glossing over of the layers that are there within that danger zone, coming from the place, the historical and cultural, like, places that could be seen, the decontextualization. So decontextualization can be violent too, right, in some ways. And I think that's, you know, I think that goes back to kind of the beginning of our conversation in terms of, if you were to recognize the power of blood in Ana Mendieta's work, that may destabilize some of your authority in order to comment on it. I mean, in some ways. And I think that's a really wonderful point. But what made me think of that, a lot of the artwork that we're discussing, as well as kind of the vernacular material culture artwork that I look at, is layered and coded to be seen in multiple ways. So in some cases, you may be looking at something, but unless you have a level of knowledge or initiation or whatever it is, you may not be seeing the whole story, the layers. So some of the work may be deliberate, and this is true of literature too, right? Like some of this work is deliberately layered for multiple audiences, that in which the semiotics and the coding is to protect itself sometimes from that violent gaze, right? Because secrecy is sometimes a very important tool of maintaining history and maintaining connections. So
yeah, that is definitely a really, really important point.
It's all really great. I think we're gonna move into the Q&A questions now because it's already 7:40. I want to start with one, actually. Solimar Martin Singh wrote in a question for you, and I thought this would be great because you do mention him. He says, Solimar, thank you for including my work in your presentation. I am deeply honored. Would you be able to share more of your thoughts on the bóveda as a trans-intangible space and how that relates to work a bóveda may do in terms of border crossing? So I felt like this is a really good lead-in from what we had just discussed.
Exactly. Gracias, Martin. Un abrazo y un beso from over here. Thank you for that question. So this work with the bóveda is a little bit newer work. It's kind of work that I've been working on, and I've been thinking about the vasos de agua. And the way that they're placed on a bóveda actually has a cartography to it, and they have relation to different kinds of entities and different components. So and they're objects that actually they don't transmit. They actually do they do work as spirits too. So this trans-intangible component of the bóveda, I'm thinking of it as a rhythmic remaking of materialization. And I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier in our discussion of not only bodies, but objects. So going back and forth in terms of this sharing of the consciousness of los muertos, the sharing of what houses the muerto. Is it your body? Is it the vaso de agua? What is this trans-intangible space where material is being made and unmade and remade? And so I'm really interested in that process, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet, but that's something that I've been working on as of yet. And about border crossing, again, the fact that everybody has a personal cuadro espiritual, and everybody's personal bóveda might look very different, but the beings and the entities represented there can be from all over the world, can represent many different religious traditions, can, you know, be situated in very interesting ways, and they're being placed next to each other as vasos de agua, as the bóveda as a site of contemplation. There's prayers, there's communication, there's offering, there's so much that's done there. So that space is all kinds of border crossing, whether it's culture, whether it's race. We haven't talked about racing spirits yet. Whether it's, you know, gender, you know, sexuality, all these different components are crossed within this space where, you know, this different entities are trading how they're being housed, right? So it's actually shows you that the material is actually what's the ephemeral in some ways. It really turns things around. Thank you, Martin, for that question.
Okay, so we have here one question for, I guess, both of you, and I think it really, you know, ties with what we were discussing before on what are some of the approaches that we can derive from spiritual studies, religious studies into the works of art. You touch upon some of these elements in your own presentations, but we have one question from Eric Meyer Garcia, where he specifically asks, how can these decolonial methodologies can be used for the field of art history and criticism? But also one that I think is very, very fascinating, how might faculty take actions or make space for integral approaches in teaching and mentoring future scholars? So it you know, deals with this idea of pedagogical uses of spiritual practices as related to art historical, the art historical discipline as well.
I think that maybe part of what I was saying a little bit earlier could also address this question, which is that we might be seeing increasingly more and more work that is openly, like, culturally, aesthetically hybrid, that to understand the work, you need a reference to non-Western, even if it's very hybrid, West, non-West. And so I think that in that sense, it's pretty legit, you know, to defend that, you know, just like you might have to learn a different language to study something, you know, or spend some time looking at a certain historical period. I think that that there's quite a bit of Latino art in the US and in Latin America that makes these references. For example, I love the work of Jose Bedia, but I know that I have to do a lot of research before I can teach it. And so that's an invitation, right, to really deeply, deeply try to immerse myself into the things that his work refers to, which might also include North American indigenous cultures that he's also been fascinated by. And so I think in that way, we can defend that there is an intellectual necessity to do it. But I think that as we do this work, the work itself challenges, you know, what is the intellectual, what is the embodied, you know, and how the spiritual, any word you want to really use, is a cosmology, is a philosophy. You know, the words we use are already so Eurocentric, right? Art, spirituality, you know, mind, already the word mind, you know, for contemporary usage is defined in distinction to body and to spirit, but that isn't how it is in other cultures. And so I think it's incredibly exciting that art is one of the ways in which we are being asked to, like, broaden our world. So if you're in a museum and you're looking at this work, or you're in a gallery, you're like, what is that? It's fascinating. You don't know. But if you're fascinated, you want to know. So I think that we can make room for it. And then actually, if we're teaching it, we have to make room for it and be responsible about those references.
That's beautiful answer. Absolutely. You know, I've been teaching classes I just got to IU last year, and I taught a performance studies graduate seminar last semester. And this semester I'm teaching a seminar on literature and folklore called Transculturation and the Senses. And I'm looking at sensorial and affective modes of just thinking about cultural borrowing, intermeshing, mixing, all this kinds of stuff. And I think this kind of resonates with what Laura was saying in terms of, you know, we have to always stay curious, we have to stay open, but we also, doing so, then question these categories and kind of undo the work, the pedagogical work that our students come into the classroom with, right? And I just finished teaching a novel about synesthesia by a Vietnamese American writer called, you know, the novel's called Bitter in the Mouth. And in this novel, the young girl who's growing up in the South, she tastes words when they're spoken to her, but every single word that she tastes is assimilated taste. So mom is chocolate milk, or you is canned beans, something's casserole. So it's really, for me, I feel like the core of getting to this, whether it's teaching about goddess or art or performance or literature, is rethinking the senses in some ways. Just the very basic idea of how we get to know the world around us, and how there's more senses in many different cultures than the senses that are recognized in like European cultures, right? Like the different sentidos. And what can that teach us about not only pedagogy, but how our methodologies, right? So the answer is I do a lot of work in a lot of different kinds of art and media and interdisciplinary perspectives. I have a hard time sticking to one.
I love your response, if I can jump back in, because I think that it's also by your thinking about different materials. So you are reminding me that the structures of the disciplines that we've inherited, whether they're art history, whether they're traditional literary studies, you know, whether they're anthropology, that these are connected to the histories of empire, right? This whole period happens within the last 500 plus years, which are the colonization of the Americas and enslavement. This is the construction of the Enlightenment. This is the construction of the creation of the modern university and disciplines. And so I think that it isn't just being clever, like very like deconstructionist smart. I think that, again, trying to be more accurate and more precise requires us to really think about what is the object that we're looking at. So what constitutes an art object? And I think that there's a tension that we have, that if something doesn't seem like the modern interpretation of art, which is very, as we well know, very laced with elitist histories and discourses and racialized and gendered ones, if we don't do that, then it's incredibly, if we don't examine that and engage that and question that, then it's sort of like, it's difficult. It's like becomes a circular argument, like a catch-22, a tautology, because then we aren't even able to speak about the object other than as an exception. For me, looking at non-Western practices, non-Western aesthetics, whether they're hybridized or not, it's this reminder that we haven't agreed what spirit means. We haven't agreed that there is one God, if any God. We haven't agreed that there is one thing called art, and we haven't agreed that there is something which instead of art is called craft. You know, these people make fascinating masks, and you know, how cool or whatever we think about it, but that's art. And so I don't think it's about making room so that a mask can become art. I mean, maybe if you want to, but it's not about translating away the difference, but rather for me, it's about really investigating what do things that we in this time period have called art, what do those objects do, what don't they do, what is their relationship to power, to society, to culture, and what power does quote unquote art and quote unquote artists have? And in these cultures, the things that look closest, how are they defined? Are they also so neatly separated? And we find that they're not. We really find that they're not. And I think that that helps us to think about our historical epoca of some 2-3 centuries. It really helps us to think about this modern period with a little more objectivity about how we have inherited a very delimited lens and intellectual or academic tools to think about the power of making objects that we call today art.
Absolutely, you're right on point, and I think that's going back to danger, I don't know what's wrong with me today. Dangerous objects, right? The spirit doll that I showed in one of the slides, that those were, it was a set of 4 spirit dolls. These are dolls that contain entities. They're supposed to be fed, taken care of. They were made for Ruth Landis for her protection by May de Santos in a tejero in Bahia in 1938. These dolls are living in a little shelf at the Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian. And it broke my heart to see entities that need to be spoken to and given café or whatever being kept, so they don't even count as art objects, right? They count as an oddity that's being filed away with I don't know how many other sacred objects are in that space. And so that made me also think about what doesn't count as art, or what objects are too dangerous to even consider having out into the world. Right, because it completely disorients this separation between spirit and material, and how our different disciplines can understand or colonize the taxonomies. I go back to that, these different materialities, right? So your comments made me think about, and then there's art that just is stashed away, and I think because it's dangerous to the paradigms that are at play in maintaining the academy and maintaining other kinds of power. So
we have a question here from Angela Brown, and she's asking Professor Otero specifically about mazos, and she's curious to know, how do you see the physical transformations or even translations in relation to the co-production of archives by the living, the dead, and deities?
Thank you for that question. You know, mazos are very, and Martin's off listening somewhere, but mazos are, you know, much more than they're sacred ornaments that the gods like wear under soperas, or priests or priestesses wear, and they're made with narrative intention, with prayers. They actually represent a specific road of an orisha, of a deity, and so they hold within them all sorts of stories and all sorts of association through the colors and the beadings and the numbers of the beadings that is actually translatable across different languages, right? So if that you have a maso for Yemaya Sesu, a Brazilian practitioner of Candomblé, a Yoruba practitioner from Nigeria, and a practitioner from Cuba may or may not be able to recognize that road. In terms of Archives of Conjure, I believe that process of engaging with the maso, not only as an object to be looked at, but also its energies, its frequencies, it's been prepared, opens up, and I know, Julianne, you were a little bit interested in this, that interaction that may allow for that magical futurity, that engagement that allows us to imagine future work through the stories and the associations that the maso is giving us. So, you know, a maso for Yemaya is going to have us think about the sea, is going to have us think about specific ecologies and lessons that have to do with gender, that have to do with the history of slavery in the Americas. So I think that, you know, there's a lot there. I just had, I was at another talk on Friday, and we were talking about masos, because somebody said, well, what about, do you think the rhizomatic is the best way to go? I said, well, you know, the rhizomatic's great, but I think a maso might be a really fun thing to start theorizing. And somebody from the conference was familiar, and there's a point in the maso that's a moño, where all the beads come together. It's like a moño, like you have on your, like that. And so they said, well, what would it mean if we would theorize the moño? What would we think with all these different histories, all these different legacies of Latino and African and indigenous and Asian, and that coming into that maso, that moño? What is that point in time? What does that moño mean? And I'm thinking that the moño are these sites of maybe contention, but then at the same time bringing together, and where things burst apart again. I still have to think through that, but I wanted to mention that because that was something that came up last time I was talking about mazos. So
Yeah, I think that's a very fascinating comment. And it made me think a little bit about Fidel Leiva's work, especially this really beautiful portraits of women of the African diaspora in the Caribbean with really big headpieces that combine so many different textures and so many different colors and so many different patterns. So this idea of maybe the moño or the maso as also an expression of neo-Baroque culture, and neo-Baroque as also as a way of reimbursing the logics of, you know, a very long experience or process, historical process in which very specific categories of rationalism, of understanding the world in compartmentalized ways or categories might be an interesting idea to explore for sure.
And don't sleep, Cuban artists will, or people doing art, religious art, will take in ideas from anywhere and everywhere, right? I think that this idea that you're only going to stick to lo folclórico, esto es, no, the creativity can be very, very expansive. And then the theoretical work of bringing together these different modes of expression, I think is something that can be super fruitful. So I really appreciate those.
Yeah, I guess we should start wrapping up. This was a really fascinating conversation. Thank you everyone for joining. This was really interesting, and we are very thankful to both Laura and Solimar for taking the time to express and share their research projects with us. It was very enriching and very transformative. We want to reiterate that this series just started and that we will be having another one of these iterations of Unusual Scenes in the spring of 2021. And we are very looking forward to seeing all of you again and to have another one of these conversations in which we expand the traditional limitations of the art historical practice into new interdisciplinary and creative ways. Gwen?
And yes, and we wanted to also reiterate to thank you to ISLAA and the Department of Art History, to Professor Alexandra Otero, and to everyone who helped us bring this project to fruition. It's crazy that it's gone by so quickly. It seems like we just kind of started meeting to talk about this. But I did want to also remind everyone that there will be a methodological workshop with Professors Otero and Pérez for Columbia affiliates next week on Tuesday, October 6th from 2 to 4 Eastern. So we look forward to seeing you there if you can make it. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to Julian for helping me out with this and being a wonderful collaborator through everything.
Muchas gracias. This was phenomenal. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody, and good luck with this beautiful series. It's incredibly exciting, and I was just so happy to be part of it today and to listen to the questions and, of course, to converse with all of you. And so beautiful work. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you both so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.